Hello guys, and welcome back to part 9 of our modelling tutorial series for our little Suzuki truck. So in the last episode we left off, we had just finished the tyre, and I had mentioned that we're going to go ahead and finish up the modelling. So I've gone ahead and added the last few bits, but I'm very confident at this stage, if you followed along to this point, you can absolutely do the rest yourself. So in today's episode, we are going to take a look at shading our model, using a mixture of procedural shading nodes. We'll get into what those are in a little bit. So we have our blank model right now. And one thing I'm going to do before we do anything at all is we need to add a light into our scene, okay? I have one in there already, but I'm going to go ahead and delete it. And then I'm going to come over to the Arnold tab up here, and I'm just going to press this button here called Create Sky Dome Light. Okay, this is essentially like any other light. It will light up a model, obviously, but it can use an image, or it can just render on its own, but it's best used with an image called an HDRI, or a high dynamic range image. Essentially what these are, they're 360-degree panoramic images of basically anywhere you decide to make them, or someone decides to make them. They could be of a kind of grassy field, they could be of the interior of a building, they could also just be of a sky. I've downloaded quite a few, and they're very good for lighting very reflective surfaces like trucks and cars and vehicles, because a lot of the material properties of those vehicles actually comes from the reflection, not so much the color itself. If you've ever looked at a car up close, especially from the side, and if it's been freshly cleaned or waxed, you're seeing obviously the color of the car if it's black, for example, but you're also seeing a lot of the reflected light and environment around it back being reflected into your eyes. You can download a lot of HDRIs for free from websites like Polyhaven and Ambient CG. They have a huge library of all sorts of different types. So go ahead and pick one that you think you'll like the most. Once you've downloaded your HDRI, we can select our dome light, come over to the attribute editor, and click on the color input square here. Select File, press this button here in the attribute editor, and then just navigate to where you store your HDRIs. I put mine within the images folder of the Maya project directory. I'm then going to have a look through the ones I have. I've collected quite a few over time. I'm going to go ahead and pick just a standard studio environment like this. I think I got this one from Polyhaven. Okay, and now you can see that's actually in our scene, and it's like our truck's kind of sitting, floating in space here in this little studio room. Go ahead and select your HDRI, and there's a few settings we can change before we actually start doing anything. So down here under visibility, if I put this all the way to 0, when we render, it won't actually show up. And if I have this at 1, it will. This will affect whether or not it shows up in transmission or the transparency of objects, so whether or not you want the reflectivity to show up in the windows. The diffuse, whether or not you want it to affect the color, or the diffuse as it's called, of your object. The specular, whether or not you want it to affect the shininess, the reflectivity of your object. Subsurface scattering, whether or not you want it to affect the subsurface scattering, is essentially something you get on skin, thin translucent plastics and latexes and things like that. If you've ever put your hand up to a light or a torch or something like that, you'll notice you get this very distinct red glow. That's subsurface scattering, so we won't really need to worry about that since this is a car or a truck. Indirect as well, so that's going to be for any kind of indirect light that's bouncing off of surfaces and then coming back and hitting our truck. Volume, whether or not you want it to affect volumes like atmospheric scattering. It's not something we're going to be covering in this tutorial, but just so you know what the slider does. And max bounces. So by default, for any light you create in Arnold, that'll be at 999. Now, pretty much, for all rendering purposes, that's way too high. Generally, I would recommend lowering this to something about 10. You don't really need more than that. In reality, light will bounce for however many times it does until it's fully absorbed by the material that it's hitting, and that amount depends on the material itself. But within 3D space, and while using Arnold, or any other render engine, we can adjust those bounces ourselves, and in order to have the render finish quicker, we want to reduce the number of bounces. So 10 is a nice kind of even point that I find. And we're going to leave the rest of the settings alone for the time being. The only other thing we could take a look at is the exposure and the samples. So samples kind of affects the quality of the light. You could just leave that at 1. Generally, I like to put it at 3. It will make it render a bit faster, but for the time, or a bit slower even, sorry. But for the time being, we'll just leave it at 1. The exposure is what you want to adjust to increase the intensity of your light. If I come up to here, where it says renderer, and changed from viewport 2.0 to Arnold, this is going to render within our viewport, so it's really handy to see things as they are when you go ahead and render. So now if I rotate them around my scene, you can see we're now getting our model lit. We don't have any texture on there right now, we just have the standard default material. But we're getting the shadow information and the highlights and so on. If I were to change the exposure to 1, you can now see that the lighting is much brighter on our model. Generally, when you're adjusting the intensity of a light, I avoid adjusting intensity and instead just increase exposure. But it's important not to overexpose your model, but we'll get into the lighting techniques a bit later on in the next video. So for the time being, I'm just going to go ahead and leave this at 0, and we can potentially adjust that later, seeing, how things go. Okay, so I'm just going to disable the render for the time being and come back to the viewport. Before we do anything, we want to apply a new shader to our truck. Now, what you generally want to do is have a different shader for each kind of material, because each material is going to have a different property, whether or not it's more rough, more reflective, more metallic, or even entirely different colors. So what we're going to do is I'm going to select everything, and I'm just going to go ahead and deselect all the parts that might have a different material. So for us, that's going to be the tires, the hubcaps here, the windows, and I think we can go ahead and apply the same material to everything else. So with just these parts selected, I'm going to hold down right click and go to assign new material. That's going to bring up this window here. We're looking for a material under Arnold, so we're going to click this drop down if it's not already, and then just click on Arnold, and then click on AI Open PBR Surface. There's a whole bunch of different materials in here, but we're not really interested in those right now. This AI Open PBR Surface, if I click that, is essentially the base material that's going to allow us to plug in everything else and build on top of. So you can see that's gone and brought that up in our attribute editor, and it's just called AI Open PBR Surface 2. For you it might be called 1, depends. I've already got and created one in testing for this. What I like to do before anything else is just rename this. So we know we want this shader to be the body material. So I'm going to go ahead and call this truck_body. Okay. What we can then go ahead and do is apply another material to the tires. And then we'll do the exact same process. Assign new material, Arnold, AI Open PBR Surface. You can now see that's Open PBR Surface 3 because it's the third one I've made. I'll then call this tire_rubber or something like that. We'll then do the same thing for the hubcaps. Open PBR Surface, and we'll just call this hubcaps_shader or something like that. Occasionally I'll like to do _shader. Just name it however you like, as long as it's kind of in a clean and consistent way and you can understand it. And then for the last material, we'll go ahead and apply another AI Open PBR Surface. AI, by the way, does not stand for artificial intelligence. We've had a few people get in contact with us about that with mixed reactions. AI, for whatever reason, it's like the icon for the Arnold renderer. It's got nothing to do with artificial intelligence whatsoever. We're making this ourselves, okay? Anyway, so this is going to be our window shader. So I'm going to call this Windows, or I could even call this glass, potentially, glass_shader or something like that. If you select any part of your model, you can see if I select part of the truck bed here, you can see we've got truck body material applied. If I select the windshield, you can see it says glass shader, the tire, rubber, and the hubcap, we've got hubcaps shader. Okay, so if you ever want to access that material quickly to adjust properties, just select one of your objects and you can see it here in your attribute editor. What we want to do is, if we go ahead and render again, you can see it looks the same. So right now it hasn't actually done anything, and that's because, like I was saying earlier, it's a blank canvas for us to work on. And you might notice in the attribute editor we have a whole host of different sliders here, and it looks terribly confusing. We have transmission, coat, what on earth, fuzz, what do we even do with this, emission, thin film, what are all these things? The good news is we don't have to worry about probably 60 to 70% of these for what we're going to be doing today. So don't feel too overwhelmed. We'll go through each one as and when we need to. A very handy tool that we can use with this AI Open PBR Surface and Arnold shaders in general is, if you look at the top right corner here, we've got a few different buttons, but there's one here that says presets. Now, if you click that button, you can see we have all sorts of different materials in here, from balloons to blood, even to clear water, diamonds, velvet, and wax. These are approximations. They're not entirely physically accurate, but they're fantastic starting points to work on top of. If you look through here, you can see towards the top, we've got car paint and car paint metallic. Now, the difference between these two is what it says on the tin, basically. You have car paint, which is going to be very reflective, and car paint metallic, which is the same, but it's going to have a sort of metal glint to it. We can go ahead and show you those real quick. If I click replace here, By default, it's going to set a color as well, but we can change that afterwards, and then we go ahead and render. You can now see this very, very kind of garish yellow color has been applied, but it's quite reflective now, and it's looking a lot more like car paint. Like we were saying earlier, if you look at the side of a car, it generally reflects the environment around it. You can see here we're getting reflections from the lights in the background all over the surface, and it's very, 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 very shiny, very, very like bright highlights. And then go back and go to the presets, car paint metallic, and replace. It's a different color, but you can see now, if I just let that render for a moment, it's still reflective, but it has a bit more of a metallic-ish kind of essence to it. It's hard to notice, but it is there. If you see across here, we're kind of getting a bit more metalness. You don't just have the bright highlight. We also have this secondary kind of highlight here that makes it look more like metal. For today's video, I think I'm going to go with the car paint metallic just because I quite like it, but I don't quite like this blue. I'm going to go with potentially more of a grey. We can also do the same thing for our other materials. If you remember, we have the glass and the rubber and the hubcaps and so on. So if we go ahead and select the glass and then do the exact same thing, come up to presets and then go to glass and just click replace. You can now see that is 100% transparent. It almost looks like it's disappeared, and the only reason you can kind of see what's going on in there is because it looks slightly darkened. But if I change the angle of our camera, you can see we're getting reflections on those windows. It's quite hard to see, and this will vary from HDR to HDR, but you can see from the side here, we're getting a bit of highlighting on the glass. Okay? We can do the same thing for the tires. We can go over to presets and then rubber down at the bottom here. The default rubber is quite bright, and it's not quite, like the black you'd expect on a tire, so we can go ahead and darken that a little bit. Okay, and again, this is just a base material that we're going to work on top of. And I think for the hubcaps, I'd just like something kind of simple and metallic. So for presets, we're going to come to brushed metal and replace for that as well. So there's some basic materials on our truck. We have the metallic car paint. We have the metal of the hubcaps. We have some rubber on the tires and some glass on the windows. And really, already, it's not looking too bad, but there's certainly a lot more we can do to make it look a little less fresh, a little less clean, and a bit more lifelike. One of the first things I'm going to show you how to do is how to add a little bit of chipping to the edges, right? Any kind of object in real life, when it comes out of the factory, sure, it looks perfectly clean, but over time, you're going to get little dings and dents and chips here and there, just naturally from use. You see it in everyday objects, right? What happens to your clothes? They eventually get holes in them. Cars will eventually get rust, just from, like, in essence, being outside all the time. Even if you're there in your sort of garage, they're still going to build up dust, and eventually the components start to wear down. So we want to emulate that in 3D. So for this part of the tutorial, I'm just going to change the background or the color of my truck to something a bit more like a blue. And then we're going to just stop rendering for the time being, and we're going to press this button up here, this little blue Pokeball, 8-ball looking thing. That's called the Hypershade Editor. And you're going to be presented with a whole bunch of extra information as well. On the left here, we have various different types of materials we can add. On the right, you have our currently selected material. For me, it's the truck body, and those are the same attributes that we have in the attribute editor. Up here, you can see we have all our different materials. So we have our hubcap shader, the tire rubber, truck body, and glass, and so on. You'll see some extra ones in here, like a Lambert particle, and so on. These 4 here. You don't need to worry about this. Just leave those as they are. We're going to be focusing on the materials that we've made. And down here in this graph, this node editor, as it is, you'll probably see a bunch of different materials. These are all the ones you've created. So it's looking a bit cluttered right now. And for the time being, we just want to work on the truck body. What we're going to do is select our truck body shader up here, just with left click, and we're just going to press this button here. Essentially, this will frame up or focus on only that material. So all our materials are still present in the scene, but for all intents and purposes, this is the only one we can see in the graph editor right now, and that's the only one we want to be editing. Okay, so we want to add a bit of edge chipping to this, and you're probably thinking, how on earth are we going to do that? We don't even have any UVs. Well, what we're actually doing is doing procedural texturing, where you don't actually need UVs on your object. Now, you do get less control this way, but it's a great way to quickly prototype out materials and even create final results depending on what you need to do. And for a car, procedural shading will probably be okay, unless you want to paint on something a bit more artistic or manual, but we can cover that in another video. So first things first, we're going to press tab Now that's going to bring up this search box here, and this will essentially allow you to search for anything. So if I just type in AI Open, you can see it comes up with the AI Open PBR surface we've already created. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for an AI Mix shader. Essentially what this allows us to do is combine two different shaders or materials together into one. And this is how we're going to create the chipping. So we're going to go ahead and plug the out color of our truck body into shader 1. We're then going to press tab again and create another AI Open PBR surface. Now, this is essentially going to function as the material underneath the car paint. So we want to call that something appropriate, maybe something like car metal or truck metal, and the car metal out color to shader 2. And we'll rename this mix shader to something like car body mix. If I go ahead then and apply that just to this door here, I'm holding down right click, go to assign existing material, then go to car body mix. And if I render now, you can see all that's done is actually make it brighter, right? If I apply this material to the same part, you can see all it's done is made it brighter, and it's not actually done anything that we want to do. It's not added chipping. So the reason for that is because currently, if you look at the node itself back in the Hypershade editor, you can see it's just mixing the two materials under mix weight here by 0.5. You know, if I were to minimize this, come back and render again, and reduce the mix weight to 0, you can see now we're just getting kind of like the underlying metal texture that we have. If I reduce it or increase it to 1, you can see we're just getting the car paint. So what we need to do is plug a node or material into the mix weights in order to tell Arnold that actually no, we only want this on the edges. And there's a really cool node in Arnold called the AI curvature node. This essentially looks at your object and finds the corners, essentially, and will then, if we plug that into the mix, it will tell the shader to only apply the car metal material to those edges. So we're going to take the out color red and plug that into the mix. If I go ahead and minimize the Hypershade editor now and do another render, at the moment it might look like absolutely nothing has happened. We've got our blue car paint back. But the slider we're going to pay attention to here is the radius. Right now it's just at 0.1, but if I start gradually increasing this, what you're going to see is we're getting a bit of the other car metal material coming through just on the edges. We could ramp this all the way up to something like 5 for something even more extreme. You could even set your own custom value. If I increase this to 50, you can now see a lot of the material is actually worn away, and it looks like you know, the paint's just being sanded off or something. So you kind of want to keep this between values of 1 and 5. I'll just go with something like 2.5. Maybe that's a bit too much. Maybe we'll go for around 1.5. So you can see what it's doing is it's adding a little bit of edge wear to the corners of our model, and it's just making it look a little bit more interesting, not quite as plain and perfect as it was before. What we could even do is go ahead and select our car metal shader and change the preset to something like a brushed metal. And now when we render, that'll be what's coming up underneath, is this kind of like metallic material rather than the car paint itself. If we now wanted to make this even more interesting, we could plug a noise texture into the spread input of our AI curvature node. Essentially, this will just break it up so it's not quite as uniform like this as it is right now. So if we come back to the Hypershade editor, press tab again, and just type in noise and go to noise texture. We're then going to take the color, press this little plus arrow here, and we're just going to take the out color red and put that into the spread. Now if we come back to our render, you can see not too much has changed. It does look a little bit different, but if I come just to the door here and then start adjusting the frequency of the noise texture, you can see that's actually adjusting the positioning and the placement of this kind of edge wear. And it's way less uniform. In some areas it's not there. In some areas we have a bit more of like a chunky dent. So that's another way that you can kind of break up those edges. If I wanted to just quickly apply this new material to everything that we've got car paint on, I'm going to come back to the Hypershade editor, go to where you've got your truck body shader, the original one, right click it and go to select objects with material and minimize. You can see that's now selected everything with your original car paint texture. If I now right click and go to assign existing material, we can apply our new car body mix material, and now we can get that kind of edge wear sitting on everything, not just the ones that we applied to earlier. Something else that we can do is apply a material to our windows to make them not quite as perfect, you know, because windows eventually as well, like everything else, they get a bit gritty. Even if you clean them, you're going to get imperfect reflections, okay? So we're going to go ahead and use another noise texture to add those imperfect reflections to our windows. Let's open up our Hypershade editor again. Press tab and type in noise again. We're going to take the noise texture And we're going to take the out color red and just plug that into the specular roughness. Now, if we come back to our render, you can now see our windows look like they've kind of been greased up with Vaseline. Essentially, what's happening here is this image is black and white. Now, with transparency, the color white is essentially the value of 1, which means that your object is 100% transparent. And the color black essentially is the value of 0. So as you can see here from the color of our noise, we have some white areas, some are black areas, and that's being reflected on our window, and it's changing the roughness, okay? The transmission, or the amount that the window is see-through, is still at 1 and is as high as it can go, but this is essentially mimicking the roughness of a surface in real life. You know, when you see an object in real life that is very, very rough and doesn't reflect a lot of light, it's generally because microscopically the surface is quite grainy. You know, like a mirror, it's very, very well polished, it's a lot flatter. Under the microscope it has way less imperfections, and that's why it tends to reflect more light. At the moment this is a little bit too much though, so we can go ahead and tweak this. So one of the first things I like to do if I'm using this for Windows is, instead of using the noise type below, I tend to prefer to use Perlin noise, like to increase the frequency a little bit. Maybe I'll double it up to something like 16. That's just going to make the noise pattern repeat a little more, so it's not quite as large. But our window still looks like it's covered in Vaseline, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to come over to here where it says color balance. So just click that arrow. What we can do here, so just the color gain, right now it's at white or 1. But if I start to gradually reduce this, you can see our window begins to become more and more transparent again. If I turn this all the way down, our noise texture is no longer actually doing anything because the value is set to 0 or black. If I increase this maybe just up a little bit, and you want this effect to be subtle, obviously you still need the window to be see-through, right, so the driver can see out of the window, but you just want a little bit of smudging there. So I'm going to reduce it nearly all the way down to something like this, and you can just about see here we're getting a little bit of smudging on the window. Now the angle that we look at this, it's going to make it a little bit more obvious. If we come over to something like this and leave this to render for a little bit, you can see we're getting a little bit of smudging. Okay, but nothing major, but it's just adding a little bit of interest to our glass. It doesn't look quite as perfect as it did, and you can play around with these materials to get something a little bit more perfect. You can even, if you want to add UVs to your windows, use an image texture instead, but for the time being we're just going to be using noise. So one last thing I'd like to show you today is how to add a little bit of dirt to your models on top of everything else. So we're going to actually use another mix shader. If I just stop the render here and come back to our Hypershade editor, and then if I go ahead and select our new mix shader that we made, the car body mix, just press that button there again to focus up all of that. We're going to create another AI Open PBR surface. This we're going to title Car Dirt, and we're going to make this something darker. Maybe we'll add a brown into it. Dirt very rarely is just completely black, so we'll just make this sort of a dark brown, and we'll increase the roughness slider here as well up to something like 0.6. So it's not quite as reflective. We're then going to go ahead and press tab and make another AI mix shader, and we'll title this Car Body Dirt Mix, okay, or whatever you want to call it. We're then going to take the car dirt and then plug the out color into shader 1, and then we're going to take the out color of our previous car body mix and plug that into shader 2. Again, if we go ahead and render this, you're not going to see too much of a difference. It's probably just going to make it all darker. And then if we go ahead and apply that material, you can see again, like with the scratches, it's just made it darker because of our darker dirt material. So again, like before, we need to plug something into the mix in order to tell it what to do. And instead of using a curvature node, we're actually going to use something called an AI ambient occlusion node. Now, ambient occlusion is essentially when two objects are close together, it kind of calculates the connection point, essentially, and the area where objects are closer together, Arnold then assumes that those are in shadow, and then it shades that area. But we can leverage this to actually trick Maya into adding dirt into those places that we need it. And coincidentally, that's generally where dirt tends to collect anyway, in the creases and crevices and, you know, close together surfaces like door gaps and panel lines and stuff like that. So we're going to take the out color red, and we're going to plug that into the mix of our new mix shader. Okay. If I then come back to if I then go ahead and do what we did before by selecting our car body mix, select objects with material so we can get everything there, and then we're going to go ahead and apply our new material, car body dirt mix. And it's just going to come back to the Hypershade editor so that I can select the ambient occlusion node, because we're going to want to tweak that in our main perspective view here. We'll go ahead and render again. So it might not look too obvious right off the bat, but if you zoom in, you can see in these areas now, we're getting a bit of dirt and dustiness. If I were to turn down the spread entirely, right, if I just adjust that there, you can see that's affecting the corners, right, and the closer together areas. If I turn it all the way off, you can see here we basically have nothing, but if I put the spread all the way up, you can see we have dirt coming in. So that's how, using very few number of nodes, you can go ahead and start to create something a little bit more realistic and lifelike for your materials. Now obviously this is by no means where I would leave this. You can do a lot more to improve this and make this more realistic for your own models as well, but this is just a starting point to get you started and get you used to using these nodes and the node editor. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. In the next one, we're going to be taking our models, so make sure you've got them with shaders and textured if you want to as well. In the last part, we'll actually show you how we can create a nice kind of aesthetic looking render of our truck. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Again, if you have any questions at all on any parts of the series so far, please do let us know. I know we've had to rush over some things, so, you know, if there's anything you feel like we missed or you'd like to see more on, let us know. We can make another video. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.